Well, grace and peace from our God who loves. Greetings from Bethany Lutheran of Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. I am Pastor Gary Graff, pastor at Bethany Lutheran, and we'd like to remind our listeners that all activities are canceled at Bethany Lutheran at present, and as soon as circumstances change, we'll get word out to you and hopefully return to life as usual back at Bethany Lutheran in Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. Well, today is the fifth Sunday in Lent, and we have a reading from the Old Testament, a reading from the prophet Ezekiel, which was prophesied some 500 years before the coming of Christ. Listen to these words that describe a type of resurrection of the dead. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was a valley full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very, very dry. He asked me, "Son of man, can these bones live?" I said, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then he said to me, "Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you, and make flesh come upon you, and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone upon bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, "Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of man, and say to it, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live." So I prophesied as I was commanded. And breath entered them, and they came to life, and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what the Sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord, and that I have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord your God." Here ends the reading. One of the incredible things that we discover as we read and study the Old Testament is that it very seldom talks about a resurrection of the dead. Oh, there are a few references to life after life. And in the Psalms, people often hope that someday they would dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But these hints are only hints. They are not fleshed out and talked about in sermons or psalms or prophetic teachings. In the Old Testament times, people pretty much believed that life was very short, and in that short lifespan, God either rewarded you for being righteous or punished you for being wicked. They didn't think much about life after life until our lesson for today, written again about 500 years before the coming of Jesus. Our reading from Ezekiel this morning is one of those great readings from the Old Testament, just chock full of Sunday school imagery that reminds us of Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. Ezekiel envisions this valley of dry bones and brings them to life. It's a powerful vision. But strangely enough, as we read this lesson, we discover that it refers not to individuals being resurrected from a physical grave, but instead it refers to a nation being resurrected from exile. The nation Ezekiel was concerned about was the nation of Israel, held captive for 70 long years in the land of Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. For 70 years, it was like a nation that was dead. For in 586 BC, Israel's army was defeated and all her leaders taken away as captives. Imagine all of ancient Israel's leaders captive. All the craftsmen, all the teachers, all the priests, all the nobility, all the royal families, all the generals, all the government officials. Nothing but peasants left in the land, and even their numbers were greatly reduced. But then thanks to a change in the political climate of the day, all these captives and their families were allowed to return to their homeland of Israel. Ezekiel described it as a raising of the dead. The nation that had been just a corpse in the grave was now getting flesh back on its bones, and God was breathing the spirit of life back into his dead and defeated people. Wow, wow, and wow again. What an exciting time it was for Ezekiel and God's people, the Jews of old. What a day. And after this was accomplished, the Jewish people began to think, well, if God can do this for a nation, might he not be able to do this for us as individuals? Resurrect us from our physical graves? And when they looked at their scriptures, all those hints of the resurrection in the Old Testament began to make sense to them. Maybe there is more than just 70 years to a man's life. Maybe there is a resurrection of the dead. And just as God's people were beginning to really wrestle with this question, in 33 AD, who comes on the scene but Jesus of Nazareth? And as if in answer to this burning question in his people's hearts, what does God give his people but Jesus raised from the dead on Easter morning? Wow, wow, and wow again. The hand of God at work in the history of his people. And today we are gifted with this Old Testament reading too. It is the Old Testament reading for the fifth Sunday in Lent, preparing us for Easter and the good news of Jesus' victory over the grave. Only maybe what we need is not just the New Testament understanding of this text, but also the Old Testament understanding. We need to know that God can resurrect not just individuals from the physical grave, but also whole nations from death. It is indeed so very strange to see our whole nation seemingly asleep on the job. This busy nation, usually so full of life and activity, has come to a virtual standstill. There are no cars on the streets, no skies filled with plane after plane, no stock market setting record after record. And we wonder, will life ever come back to these dry bones? Will the sleeping giant of America ever awaken from its death-like slumber? The answer in our lesson for today is yes. Absolutely yes. Only, it might not be the kind of resurrection we are expecting. The nation of Israel in Ezekiel's time was indeed resurrected from the dead. Only it was a different kind of resurrection than people were expecting. When the Israelites came back to their homeland of Israel, they were expecting a king like King David sitting on the throne, somebody that legends are made of. They were expecting him to have an army that could defeat their enemies. They were expecting a land flowing with milk and honey and money to boot. But much to their surprise, they never did get their King David back on the throne. They never did get their mighty army or a booming economy. They had the temple, the land, and each other, but that was pretty much the extent of it. For all intents and purposes, they were only a small vassal state controlled by the great empires of their day. But behind the scenes, something exciting was happening. God was at work. God's people, though not a superpower among the nations, were rekindling their faith. They were putting together a collection of holy books that would become known as the Old Testament. And in their local synagogues, they were studying that Word of God as never before. And when Jesus came on the scene, many of them were ready for something new and different. Jesus was a new kind of king, ruling not through the power of the sword, but through the power of his great and mighty love. And when he rose from the dead, he gave his followers the power to spread this movement near and far, eventually becoming the prevailing religion of the old Roman Empire in just a few short centuries. Who would have thought that little Israel was capable of doing such a thing? Who would have thought that their little book known as the Bible would one day find its way into the homes of over 1 billion people all over the world? And who would have thought that its most famous king, a peasant from Nazareth crucified on a cross, would one day help and guide hundreds of millions of people from every nation, every tribe under the sun? It's not the kind of resurrection that Ezekiel's people were expecting. It was not a return to the good old days, but instead it was the gift of new life. A way of connecting with God and one another that no one had ever dreamed possible. And isn't that the kind of resurrection we are looking for too? Not just a return to the same old, but something new and exciting and different and wonderfully better. A new world in which we see our neighbors not just as competitors, but as brothers and sisters. A new world in which we worry less about things and more about people. A new world in which we start caring about our little rowboat called planet Earth, lest we cause it to fall apart and sink. Isn't that the kind of Easter we all long for? The kind of resurrection we really need? Yes, things look pretty dead right now. But that's often when God is at his busiest and best. May God bless us with a real Easter this year that brings us not just the same old, but new life, given to us through the one who was dead but now lives and reigns eternally. Amen. And now I'd like to close our worship for today with a prayer by Pastor Gary Weaver. Listen to these words and pray along with me, please. Dear God, please set our feet on solid ground. Help us to remember our own lives and all the little deliverances you have provided for us. Put a new song in our mouths that we may sing with joy of your kindness and mercy. We would ask to be saved from suffering, O Lord, but if not, then from the slavery to suffering. Save us from the clinging captivity to fear. Save us from the awesome abyss of sorrow and grief. And when we fall, give us faith to trust that you will catch us and to walk with us out of the valley of death and into the newness of life. Good Shepherd, lead your sheep when we are able to follow. And when we get lost, find us. When we are wounded, heal us. When we grow weary, carry us in your arms. Amen. Now go in peace and serve the Lord. Amen.